Shabbat Shalom. I'm caught on this Shabbat of Kedoshim because I don't know if I want to tell you the end of a story or the beginning of a story. And I know the reality is we're really caught somewhere in the middle of the story. And that is really important because we are in the middle of the Torah. This is Davka in Leviticus 19. We're right in the middle of Leviticus, which if you've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, this is the heart of Torah. And river. River, this is your big moment. Could be pomegranate peppers in this for you. What does the root Kuf Daled Shin mean? Good. Extra bonus points. Thank you, River. So, as River says, the root for Kedoshim is Kadosh, Kuf Daled Shin. You know it from Kiddush, right? When we acknowledge the holiness of Shabbat and our connection through wine, through Kaddish, where we acknowledge the holiness of life through those we have lost. And here's the bonus, Kiddushin. Does anyone know what Kiddushin is? I'm going to look out at my married couples and wonder, do any of you know what Kiddushin is? They're thinking, they're wondering. You got an answer on chat. It is not the, well, Kedoshim is the holiness code. Kedoshim is, but Kiddushin is not the holiness code. Raise your hand if you're married. How many of you got married under a chuppah with a ketubah and such that? How many of you exchanged rings? Richard, did you and Jane exchange rings? Okay. So then you have experienced Kiddushin. Kiddushin is the marriage ceremony because the marriage ceremony is about the holiness of the relationship of one person to another. So here we are. You can see that how powerful and how vital that root is. This section of Leviticus is this whole holiness code. It's this whole code about how we move through the world in order to be holy like God. And as I said, I have a beginning of a story and I have an end of the story, and I struggle because I don't know, do you want the good news or the bad news? Because I'm like, maybe I should go for the bad news first, because let me give you and then come to the good news at the end, or do I lead with the good news and get you up and realize there is a happy beginning or happy end at the beginning? I told you, all of the parts of the puzzle. Do you want the good news first or the bad news first? Bad news. So here's the bad news. The bad news is that our world is incredibly broken. You all know that. Earlier this week, I came across a story that is the epitome of it. It was a story about a school district in Texas where they started getting captured photos from people's social media. A group of ninth graders, white ninth graders, decided that they were going to have a virtual slave trade and slave auction of their black classmates. And they got screenshots, and it went to the school district and the school board, and they said, oh, it's bullying, we'll take care of it. And they said, no, that's not bullying, that's like blatant, violent racism. And it kept escalating, and finally the students in question are now facing significant consequences. But then it was, is this an isolated incident? Oh, these are a few bad kids. But then they started recounting, as you go through the article, it starts telling about this thing that happened in that school district where a second grader got attacked, and this thing that happened with racially charged in the school district, and this at another school. And the list got longer and longer, and you're realizing here is such an example of the racism that is endemic in our country in so many ways. And it was heartbreaking because they're not teaching racism in the schools, and yet here are these kids, young people, living out racism in these schools, and it undermines all of the education they're trying to do. I'm looking at this story, and I'm like, how do you respond to it? How do you fix it? Because I know it's not just that school district in Texas. Because as soon as I said that to my family, what do I start getting regaled with stories about racism that happens in my kids' everyday experiences? It is a tough world. And if you think that's just one piece of the example, have you all heard the news of what's going on in Israel? And I don't even know which is the chicken and the egg when you have ultra-nationalist groups of Jews marching towards Damascus Gate in the old city of Jerusalem, screaming death to the Arabs, and then the Arabs and the Palestinians responding because they're in the midst of Ramadan and going back and forth with violence and protests and police trying to be in the middle of it, and there are rubber bullets and there is skunk water being sprayed and tear gas everywhere. And Israel, in a time when it should be coming together because it's Shabbat and it's Ramadan, in the midst of the counting of Omer, finds itself in upheaval. There are too many examples of that, which I feel like is the beginning of the story. It's the beginning of, here is this brokenness. What are we going to do about it? Because our tradition says that you're supposed to be holy like God and do things. You're supposed to feed the widow, the stranger, and the orphan. You're not supposed to keep a worker's wages. You're not supposed to stand in the blood of your neighbor, of your friend. I read that story in Texas, and that's standing in the blood, talking a slave trade with your classmates, standing in their blood, saying, oh, look at this horrible history. Let's now make fun of it and put our classmates under a microscope. If that's not al tachmod dam re'echa, don't stand in your neighbor's blood. The Kedoshim, it has this entire list. Have just courts. Don't favor the rich and don't lift up the one in need. It talks about not lying, not cursing, not putting a stumbling block in front of the blind, and not cursing the deaf. Basic things, because if you do these things, you need to do these things to be holy. As I said, it was pretty grim, and it's dark, and that's the bad news. Now I'll get to the end of the story, which I think is also somewhat of a beginning of a story, because I also had one of those amazing experiences that I often have, where I find a piece of text, a fictional story or a quote, and I read it, and I'm like, that's really amazing, and then I immediately hear a true story of how that comes to life. So you hopefully looked at what I offered before, the silent prayer. And these are the words of Maltby V. Babcock. He's an early 20th century theologian. And he wrote, opportunities do not come with their value stamped upon them. Every one must be challenged. A day dawns quite like other days, and in it a single hour comes. Quite other hours, but in that day and in that hour the chance of a lifetime faces us. To face every opportunity of life thoughtfully and to ask its meaning bravely and earnestly is the only way to meet the supreme opportunities when they come. Here I am reading this, saying that everything we do has a value, but we never know what that value is. How often, sometimes we get to know it in that moment, but how often in hindsight, and how do we think about our actions and feel the weight of their value? Feel the weight of their holiness to make something special in our world. You think you might be just bending down to pick up and hand something to somebody, you might have just made their day. You find a lost object, you put a smile on somebody, you tell somebody thank you. There's so many little things and big things that we do that change the nature of our world. So what's the true story? It's a beautiful story about a woman who grew up in Hawaii, part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. When she was 4, her older brother, who was a teenager, her older brother Larry, had been on a mission trip with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He had been in Brazil, and he dies on this mission trip. And all she remembers, she kind of remembers the funeral. She hears stories that he was murdered. Something happened to him, and the family just shuts down. They don't really talk about it. The parents refuse to talk about it. The brothers, there were 3 other brothers she had, they drift away because no one really wants to talk about it. And Lori, this woman, she's trying to understand it, and she goes decade by decade, and not being able to get answers from her parents, not being able to get answers from her brothers, finally finds out that her brother actually had a journal. And then one of the older brothers has it, but he doesn't want to turn it over. And they go year by year. She's always kind of wondering, trying to get a glimpse of who her brother Larry is. Finally, after reaching out to the other people on this mission, she actually makes contact with somebody who is in Brazil, who is the coordinator for that program in Brazil, and he sends her documents, and it turns out to be the funeral service for her brother, where she actually finds out for the first time that he had committed suicide. And now she's like, wait, I don't know who my brother is. I was 4 years old. And she just struggles and struggles. And then finally, something shifts and changes. One of her older brothers has a medical illness up in Wisconsin. She lives in Texas. And she drives from Texas up to Wisconsin to visit her brother. And while she's doing that, she reaches out to the older brother, the one who has the journal, and she says, I'm going to stop by because I would like to see the journal. It all suddenly somehow works out. She goes, makes contact, renewing that relationship with the one brother, and stops in Tennessee to be able to see the journal. And starts sitting all night. She stays up all night that night, reading this rather incredible journal, getting to know her brother. And as she says, I don't really get to know my brother. All I get is these little fragments about the dates goes on, about sneaking out to go see movies. Some of the things that she did growing up and that she has done, she starts to see her brother talking about them and experiencing them. What is extraordinary in this story is the very end. Because what she says is that she realized she was not going to ever get her brother back. Even having the journal and reading it, it really didn't bring Larry back. But something extraordinary happened in that whole process of trying to find out these memories of her brother. Because in that process, they ended up connecting with the brothers, and the brothers that had been dispersed suddenly became a family again. They realized that Larry was not there, but in that act of restoring his memory, each of them with their own piece, each one having to have their piece for those period of years until they reached this moment when it was time to bring all of those pieces together. Opportunities do not come with values stamped upon them. Everyone must be challenged. A day dawns quite like other days. In a single hour comes other hours. But in that day and in that hour, the challenge of a lifetime faces us. To face every opportunity of life thoughtfully and ask its meaning bravely and earnestly is the only way to meet the supreme opportunities when they come, whether open-faced or disguised. It's precisely what this family did. In that moment, after all of these moments of being separated, in that moment of trying to create this picture of their brother, they end up finding one another once again. All of us go through life having those moments. We each have different pieces that we have a chance to offer each other. Sometimes we don't even know which piece we have in order to be able to make that moment of special connection. I share that with you, that story, that image, because that is holiness. This moment when they talk about the brother saying, I had the journal and I needed to have the journal, but now I realized I was holding the journal for when it was time to give it to you. And thinking of that journal being passed from one sibling to another, and in that moment, that whole spark of holiness and connection. I think about our broken world, as I think about both of those stories, the beginning and that ending, and I think about that value of Kedoshim, that value of holiness, of how are we going to do these acts of repair in our world. And that is when I started to see this story in such a different way. I wasn't asking necessarily the right question. We don't hope for holiness so that we can go and fix the world. We don't hope that we get that holy feeling so that we go out and do these things trying to emulate God. Our challenge to us, as you think about those two stories, as you look at the brokenness of our world, as you think about these siblings and the connection that they made, I think the answer is the opposite of them. That we use that sense of holiness, that we reach out and make these connections, because it is when we go out and do acts of connection that will create the holiness, that will inspire us, that will guide us, that will lift us up, so that we not look for a world of holiness where all of that stuff happens, but where we have an opportunity, by reaching out to each other and caring for each other, create a world where that holiness exists. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.